think, to be honest, what I'm going to say will raise more questions than answers, because you know, on the incredibly complex subject of exactly what the education system should look like, or what the education system that Labour should try and implement in 2020 is a very, you know, that's a very big subject, and not one I could ever claim to have all the answers to. I certainly, having been in the Labour Party a matter of months, don't have the answers to how we get the Labour Party to take up, you know, an education policy that we want to see in 2020. But that, I think, is what we need to discuss, because that's what needs to happen. What do I know? I do know that Jeremy Corbyn coming to NUT conference and essentially saying, you know, not only is he against academies, not only is he against the white paper, not only is he, you know, pro qualified teacher status, not only is he pro national pay and conditions, that he's actively pro trade union and will back industrial action. Let's not mess about. That is an enormous step forward on what we've had. I mean, you know, the idea that I'd be in the Labour Party shocks me. The idea that I'd be in the Labour Party listening to the leader of the Labour Party, not a backbencher, the leader of the Labour Party, basically saying, you know, you're right to go on strike and you're right to fight. That is, you know, a change that we have to continue to recognise. It does change everything. But I think we've got to, you know, particularly when we're talking about the Labour Party, we've got to recognise, I think, that opposition to Tory policies is simply not enough. You know, obviously in the NUT, the absolute priority at the moment is everything has to be thrown into this ballot, everything has to be thrown into the campaign to stop forced academisation of every school and to protect our national pay and conditions. As a trade union, we have to defend our pay and conditions. The Labour Party, I think, obviously, we want back in industrial action and the rest of it. But I think the biggest job of help the Labour Party can do is to give a vision of what else there could be in education. So it's not simply we want to stop what's happening, we want to stop what's happening because this is how it should be, and it's the this is how it should be that I think is really, you know, what we've got to discuss. You know, we know we don't want academies, and I disagree with a few things Lloyd said in some ways. You know, it's not privatisation by the back door. This is privatisation kicking the door in and driving a tank through it. It's not, you know, there is no justification really put forward. This is absolutely naked. We are taking apart the state system. We're giving it to these companies. It is absolutely clear. I also think that we've got to recognise, and it's very important we recognise, that academies, yes, they were a Labour policy. They were not a Labour policy that wasn't thought through. You don't say you can only have money for new buildings if you privatise a school, unless you've got a fundamental idea that you want to privatise schools. It was not about standards. Standards is a massive cover for privatisation. Standards are whatever your tests, you know, you want to show. And I think we've got to recognise that there is still a section, a large section, particularly in the Parliamentary Labour Party, that wants to marketise education. And that has to be dealt with. And I think one of the key ways of dealing with that is coming up with an alternative. What is that alternative? In some ways, it's the easiest thing to say is, you know, let's whack the clock back to, you know, the year 2000, you know, before the kind of initial academy programme kicked off. That's, you know, I've got a lot of sympathy for that in a lot of ways. That's correct in a lot of ways. But is that an inspiring message that we can really go out and say to parents, oh, let's put it back to what it was like 15 years ago? I'm not sure that's good enough. I'm not sure it was all that great, you know, in 2000. There was still a lot of problems. And I don't think that, you know, it's going to win the ideological argument. So what should we put forward? I'm very interested, and you know, I think there needs to be more said about what Corbyn said during his leadership campaign of this National Education Service. He came out with this idea, and it was talked about a bit, written about a bit. There was not much, you know, in terms of meat on the bones, but it certainly seemed about having a sort of cradle-to-grave ability to access education. That's absolutely great, I think. And adult education should not be ignored just, you know, because in the NUT, of course, we mainly represent sixth form teachers. We need to make sure that, you know, that if we're talking about a national education service, we know what that means. Is it like the NHS? What is the role of local authorities if we want this overall, you know, overarching institution that will take care of education from, you know, your short start centres all the way through to universities and adult education colleges? How do we combine what is in effect a nationalised education system with local democratic control? I think that's very important. How do we see this being brought in? You know, in 2020, essentially, what we've got, or what the Labour Party has to do, is try and reverse 30 years of neoliberalism in, you know, a breakneck pace, and that is not easy to do. So, are we realistically saying the nationalisation of the school system? Some things are easier. You know, I think on day one of a Labour government, you could harmonise terms and conditions quite easily, and that would undermine a lot of the reasons for academies to exist. You could immediately make QTS a requirement and put in place, you know, funding for training courses for any unqualified teachers to get QTS quickly. You could remove fees, all of that sort of thing. But I think we need to have that discussion about how you would administer and what the structures of an education system we want, you know, from 2020 going forward to look like. So I think that vision is really important, and you know, we've got to talk about also how we get there in the Labour Party. The Labour Party is, I've heard someone today at a Labour Party teachers meeting say the Labour Party is a new party since, you know, Corbyn got elected. Well, yeah, and no, because you've still got the Brighton Labour Council. What was their response to the white paper? We'll start our own co-op trust. Where was the discussion with the local Labour Party? Where was the discussion with the local teachers' union? They just came out with it. There's no democracy. There's no attempt to say, actually, this is wrong on a fundamental basis, we'll fight it. That is completely unacceptable, and we've got to deal with that. So, you know, we in the 60s and 70s, you know, it's before my time, not before some of yours, I don't know, but we've got to learn. I wasn't saying you, we've got to learn from that. Because I mean, as far as I understand, in the run-up to sort of the kind of rollout of the progressive, comprehensive education era, in you know, when you got rid of the 11+ in most places and that sort of thing, we had decades of discussion and debate about what sort of education policy do we want. We haven't got time for that. We've got 4 years to kind of come up with something more than just whack the clock back. And I think that debate's got to start happening now. We've got to, you know, have that debate so we know what we're talking about, so we can hammer the right wing in Labour Party in debates, so we can hammer the Tories in debates and at elections. You know, and we've got to understand how we, you know, we've come up with the ideas. How do we get into Labour conference? How do we make Labour policy? God knows that's clear as mud to someone new in the Labour Party. So I said it was more questions than answers, but it's quite exciting. You know, you get to daydream. What is the education system I want? Because if we can start from there, we can put forward something that can, you know, inspire parents and students to go out and to vote Labour and to know it's going to mean something.